I already warned you, this is going to be a very short break only, because we are looking forward to a very, very exciting panel with 6 really esteemed panelists. And it is a pleasure seeing a lot of old friends here online, and I very much wish that you would have been able to be here and that we would have been able to celebrate the topic of AI and resilience personally, but these are the times we are currently facing. So I thank you for making the time at all, because I know how awfully busy you are in trying to build the resilience which you need and taking a close look at global value chains. So let me quickly introduce our panelists. With us today is Dan Mulaney. He is Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe and the Middle East in the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Dan, it is such a pleasure seeing you again. Thank you so much for making the time. Also here with us is Martin Bachmann. He's Senior Vice President and Global Head of Solution Management and Digital Supply Chains from SAP, and also one of the supporters of our conference today, and working from a practical point of view on resilience and supply chain issues. So thank you so much for joining us today. Also with us today is Marion Jansen. We've also known each other for a long time. She is now Director of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. And I really wished you could have made it over here, but that's what we have to deal with today. Short-term decisions also by the organizations we work for, allowing us to travel or not allowing us to travel. But thank you so much for joining us online. And also with us today is Denis Redonnet. He is Deputy Director General, European Commission. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very much looking forward to your insights. Hazit Stenke, it's so nice seeing you again after we had just, I have to look at the camera, but I'm seeing you here. This is why I'm looking up and down. So it's really nice seeing you today again after we had just seen each other a month ago in Italy, where we talked about NATO and resilience and what NATO could and should do about resilience. So I'm very happy that you are here today. And Sandra Weser, thank you so much for also making it today. You will bring in the German voice in this very, very international panel. And I know with the new government just forming these days and the new coalition and saying goodbye to our chancellor tomorrow and everything what is going on politically, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate that you made the time. I do not want to start with a lengthy description of what we are going to talk about. We all know a lot happened in supply chains, and artificial intelligence plays a very big role in it. And we also know that the crisis showed us that we are really quite vulnerable. But we also came through the crisis not so badly with regard to supply chains. So we bounced back pretty fast as well. So what we want to, this is the theme we want to discuss. And what I would like to ask all of our panelists for the beginning, a brief question with just a brief answer of all of you, from all of you, is what you are currently observing in global supply chains. How are they and have they changed because of the crisis, and where are our vulnerabilities? And I would like to start with Marion. Because the OECD is a data cracker. So tell us a little bit about what you're observing.
Thank you, Stormy, and very pleased to be here, albeit only digitally today. We were asked to prepare 3 points, 3 main aspects of the value chains as they've developed during the pandemic, and I would like to make the following 3 points. First, we have found that at the beginning of the pandemic, global value chains performed well and resisted very well. Actually, thanks to global value chains, we could deal with a lot of problems at the beginning of the crisis. Second point, in the second year of the crisis, 2021, that's where we have been seeing serious supply chain disruptions, and we are still in the middle of that. And third, when we listen to discourses from different parts of the public, we find that there is quite a difference between the policy discourse, some often referring now to the terms like decoupling, and the private sector that uses the co-words a lot, more coherence, more collaboration, cooperation, and more better communication. Coming back to the first point, what we have seen at the beginning of the crisis was a huge demand shock, increased demand for things like masks, disinfectants, and other sanitary products. At the global level, supply chains reacted rapidly to this. We saw, for instance, a tenfold increase of exports of masks within 1 month of time. Yet we have seen problems in individual countries, including in Germany, but that was due, according to our analysis, to big surges in demand. No single country would have been able, in the combined shock that we saw, to respond to all of this at the same time. Supply chains reacted quickly. The second problem, supply chains being in trouble now, is, according to our analysis, due to an unfortunate combination of at least three things. First, we have seen production picking up again at different speed in different places of the world. China went out of confinement earlier than, for instance, Europe or United States. So China is exporting with containers going from Asia to the West, with containers cannot be filled to go back into the other direction. Second, demand has shifted. For instance, huge increases in demand for electronics because of teleworking, because of more entertainment at home. And that also changes what has to be transported from one place to the other. And third, big problem still on the services side. Services trade is not back to where it was. We however see that in China, services exports are beyond where they were before the crisis, mainly due to increases in transport services, whereas in the West, where tourism services play an important role, services exports continue to be down. So three phenomena that explain this problem that we are currently seeing. The private sector is asking us to help them to install better communication and cooperation between public and private sector, and also encourages governments to make more coherent policies and to collaborate more in order for things to more easily cross borders. I will leave it here, and I look forward to listen to the rest of the discussion.
Great, thank you so much for starting us off, giving us a very good overview. And you also mentioned already the private sector. So Martin, let me turn to you and ask you from a business perspective, what is changing in global value chains? And maybe you can also already bring in the perspective on what can AI do to help us maybe to address our vulnerabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Marion said it really well in terms of what's happened. What we're seeing is the emergence of three dimensions of what's important for supply chains, right? So we've seen that it's important for supply chains to be resilient, customer-centric, and sustainable, right? So resilient means the supply chain is able to absorb shocks and bounce back, either to where it was or to a better place. That is now very much a focus topic. At the same time, supply chains have to be customer-centric. Demand patterns have shifted. The mix of products that customers and organizations and governments are ordering or demanding is different. And sustainability has now even more come to the forefront. It's not just about meeting the overall goals around sustainability, but supply chains that rely upon scarce raw materials or single-threaded are unable to operate in a sustainable way. And I think it's fair to say, if a company aspires to be sustainable, their supply chain has to be operating in a more sustainable way. What's interesting is, what are the common themes around what has allowed companies to fare better and attain those three dimensions? And the one common theme that we see is this notion of digitalization. And I'm not talking about just a conversion of analog data into digital form, but rather leveraging vast amounts of information that is now available and changing the way that decisions are made so that you can make decisions faster and better and in a fundamentally different way. And that, I think, is where terms like artificial intelligence, machine learning is really the backbone of what's powering that type of digitalization, which I'm sure we'll talk more about here as the panel, as we continue our discussion.
Well, thank you so much. And we definitely come back to the issue of utilizing huge amounts of data to identify vulnerabilities, but also to react to them maybe in real time. And sometimes I find it hard to wrap my mind around it, how it really works. And I'm sure you can explain that to us in the second round. Let me now turn to Denise. How are, the same question to you, for the European Union, how have our value chains been hit by the crisis? What are you observing, and how can technologies help us?
Sure, thanks very much, Tommy. Very great to be with you on this panel. Look, I think from our perspective, of course, my perspective is more of a policy perspective. I think we very much agree. I very much agree with what Marion was saying. I mean, our first major takeaway from what has been happening over the last few years from a government perspective is that we have to be clear that the pandemic, the crisis that ensued, was not in and of itself a crisis of global value chains or of international economic integration. Most value chains have shown resilience. They are acting not just as a contributor to economic efficiency, but as shock absorbers as well, and will contribute to repair and avoid disorganization in order to contribute to the recovery. Of course, that requires that supply chains are adequately resilient, which in our understanding of the term would mean, and I think I would agree with what Martin was saying, both diversified, sufficiently and adequately diversified, but also sustainable. And sustainability is therefore becoming also in our policies, including in our trade policies, an important component. Point number one. Point number two, I think we're very clear that we're experiencing in the EU, across the 27 member states, disruptions and disorganizations now that Marion was talking about. And we need to separate, I think, clearly the diagnostic between what's happening in the short term, what's happening on a more structural basis. Now, in terms of getting a proper assessment of vulnerabilities and capabilities in some of our major industrial ecosystems in Europe, we have, out of the public authorities, out of the EU institutions, tried to do a proper fact-based, evidence-based mapping of this. We did this in the spring when the European Commission brought forward an update of the EU industrial strategy. And there basically the findings are fairly clear. If we look at a universe of products that corresponds to these most sensitive or critical ecosystems, the sheer number of products and the volume of trade and imports that these products represent that are genuinely vulnerable in the sense of products that suffer from a very high import dependency and concentration, and products where diversification or the development of domestic capacity may not be easy to achieve, are actually a very limited subset of these industrial ecosystems, mostly in terms of critical raw materials and mostly in the health sector. So it's not a wholesale problem of vulnerability. It's a targeted question of vulnerability that their public authorities have to have policies to address, and not on their own. We believe very much that this issue of supply chain resilience is an issue that should be the subject of discussions and engagement with partners, including the most like-minded partners of the European Union. That is, for example, the case of the United States. That's why we're very happy that under the newly established Trade and Technology Council, and perhaps Dan will talk about this, we have strands of work and discussions on these issues, on our respective dependencies, on our common dependencies, for example, vis-à-vis China. And these are dialogues that we think we must nurture in order to contribute to the question of resilience. Final point, there it's a little bit more negative or worrying from our point of view. We also think that to some extent the tensions that we've seen over the last few years have highlighted more structural systemic tensions beyond this temporary disorganization of supply chains and tensions in the trading system. And that tensions are manifold. One is there is a certain spillover of geopolitical tensions in the world of trade and investment. And that is linked in part to rivalries. I'm thinking about the US-China relationship, but that affects us in Europe as well. And we've got to be mindful of this going forward. We've also seen that there are underlying structural and systemic distortions in the trading system that predated the crisis, that are still there and will continue to be there and need to be addressed. I'm thinking about a range of non-market distortions coming from non-market policies and practices, which we have to find ways of addressing. And this is why there again, engagement and cooperation matters. The relaunch of the trilateral process on trade between the US, the EU, and Japan this week is one of the avenues for dealing with this. And we are concerned, finally, because this is happening in an environment where we have a weakened rules-based trading system with the WTO at its center. And in our view, part of what public authorities, governments need to do on the policy side is to ensure that we move and are capable of having more global trade rules, that we work on WTO reform in order to ensure, first and foremost, predictability in international economic relations, which at the end of the day is what undermines also stable and resilient global supply chains. I think I'll leave it with that, introducing perhaps those more policy aspects into the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a lot of food for thought and almost a 10-point plan how to increase our trade resilience. And I'm glad that you pointed at the nexus between trade and investment. And later on today, we are also going to have the pleasure of welcoming Rebecca Greenspan from the UNCTAD. With whom we are also going to talk about this nexus. Let me now, because you already mentioned it, Denise, the TTC and the transatlantic relationship, I mean, so central to making us more resilient. So I hand over to Dan for your thoughts.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Stormy. Really great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, in the transatlantic space, we've been very busy over the last 9 months. We've removed some significant trade irritants with respect to the WTO case on aircraft. Of course, the discussions on steel and aluminum, and sort of the threatened trade irritants as a result of the digital services tax. And in several of those instances, including with respect to the aircraft sector and steel and aluminum, we've started a process of determining how we can work together to face common challenges that we face, not only with respect to non-market economy policies and practices, which Denis mentioned, but also with respect to climate-related resilience. You're right to point out that the other thing that we've done over the past 6 months is to set up this US-EU Trade and Technology Council, and to have its first inaugural meeting in September. And that is, among other things, aimed at building a strong and resilient transatlantic market, especially with respect to high-tech and emerging products, a market that is as free as we can make it from unnecessary barriers to trade between us. And also, and very importantly, a market that reflects our values, which is very much, I think, related to the kind of resilience that you're talking about, which includes values of rule of law, transparency, market-oriented conditions, and also protection of labor rights. But not only, we're not only seeking to reinforce this transatlantic marketplace based on our values, but we are looking to work together to project those values globally and to collaborate very closely on some of the challenges that we in the United States face, and I think the EU considers that it faces as well, with respect to some of the effects of non-market economy and practices and policies in the global environment. Because these are policies that can very much affect our resilience, can very much affect the values that we want to project when it comes to issues like artificial intelligence and other topics that you're going to be discussing during this panel. I think it's going to be extremely important, and I think we're on a good path for us to work very closely with our European allies to build this transatlantic space, to focus on resilience in a market that reflects our values, and also work together to ensure that those values are projected internationally. And I think as I mentioned, I think we're off to a good start so far over the last 9 months.
Then, if I may ask a follow-up question, you have seen up and downs in the transatlantic relationship. You have worked on TTIP, then you have not worked on TTIP during a period where it was a little bit more tricky, and now there seems to be a lot of positive dynamic again. Within the TTC, are you talking about artificial intelligence and how to jointly regulate new technologies like AI together?
I mean, there are going to be a range of topics in the TTC. It will focus clearly on the regulatory environment and how we address the regulatory challenges together. I mean, the question of joint regulation is jumping quite far ahead. I think what we can do now in the meantime is to make sure that whatever regulations or standards or guidelines are put forth in these areas of key emerging technology, make sure that they are done in a way that does not unnecessarily impinge on the free flow of goods and services between the U.S. and the EU, and also make sure that they push back against certain values that others have that we don't share. So I think very much in terms of making sure that we don't introduce unnecessary friction in the U.S.-EU relationship across the board in all emerging technologies, including AI and everything else. I think that would be very much a key focus. And as I say, it's sort of dual facing. We're focused very much on the bilateral relationship between the United States and the EU when it comes to these regulations and standards, but also the issues that we pursue globally as we pursue our joint global challenges.
Thank you so much for these insights. Let me now turn to Sandra. The German economy is extremely trade dependent. Trade to GDP, exports, imports, goods and services is more than 80%. So we were hit hard by the last couple of big economic crises which we faced. We benefit a lot from good times when trade is doing well. You have been following trade issues for a very, very long time, and for your party, I'm sure, also brought in some good ideas for the coalition agreement, for the coalition contract. Tell us a little bit about the German position on global value chains, and also certainly on technology and AI.
Yeah, thank you, Stormy, and thanks for being here today. And of course, I think the Liberal Party was always a very big friend from free trade agreements and trade in general. And I am really proud that one of my initiatives that I made a couple of months ago in the German Parliament, which was labeled Transatlantic Economic Area, became part of the coalition treaty. And that means that we have to let's say, find friends in a common sense of having the same values, sharing the same values, and going for, let's say, a transatlantic coalition. But the transatlantic means also, let's say, partners as Australia, New Zealand, and so on. But I just want to step once again to your first question, because there are a lot of very interesting things already said. But I have also made a very personal experience here in Germany. A couple of months ago, we had in my home state, Rhineland-Palatinate, huge floods in one area where really the whole region more or less is destroyed, and also its infrastructure. And the government made up a fund with 30 billion euros to help the people immediately. There were a lot of help also from the private sector. But at the end, what we had to learn is that it's not always a question of money to come out of these problems. What I understood from a political side is that we cannot solve everything with money, but we need to understand that the people, the infrastructure, and the production capacity, which ultimately determine that we can build and consume. And so we really have to get our supply chains more resilient, also focus on these kind of points. Let's say, how can we get the people working in Germany? How can we make, for example, immigration law that helps also to find all the craftsmen, all the people who can build something, who can install. For example, in this region, what I learned, that we are not able to install heating systems because we don't have the people to install them. It's not also a question of the heating system. It's a big question of the people to do this. And this we also have, let's say, to focus when we are talking about supply chains. But also, I think Germany has to diversify, to find, as I said, a lot of countries which we can work together with the same values, but also not to keep the balance too high for the treaties. I have a little bit the fear that when we are asking too much from our partners, that we will not be able to find a common space to come quickly together. We really maybe have to get a small barrier and then come to agreement, and then after this set up the next step, and after this the next step, like the European Union. It was not built as the European Union we know today. It started with a common market on coal, and therefore, I'm really a friend, a pragmatic friend, to say, let's do it really now, but step by step, and maybe not aiming too high.
Well, thank you so much, and also for bringing us back and remembering or reminding us how important resilience is for our everyday lives, really, by pointing at the floods. Has it now at NATO? You are used to doing crisis preparedness exercises. You're used to doing scenario exercises. More in the security area, I understand. Now we're talking about resilience in a much, much, much broader context. So how come that NATO is actually thinking about resilience in a very, very new kind of environment and kind of setting? And also, to pick up again my first question, what have you actually been observing with regard to value chains over the last month?
Well, thanks a lot, Stormy. Really good to be here. I wish I was in Berlin right now, given how rainy it is in Brussels. Maybe there's a chance that it's not as rainy in Berlin. But it's great to be here. I really benefited from hearing all of my colleagues on the panel with their different perspectives. I'll bring a defense and security perspective to this discussion, which I think is an interesting angle at this question of supply chains And to start with your first question, how did NATO, come to look at resilience? I think NATO has been thinking about civil preparedness and civil emergency planning for quite some time. This is a function that goes back to the 1950s, and civil emergency planning was a key part of our preparedness during the Cold War. I think many people in the audience that with memories will remember, the German civil defense and how it was linked to NATO's defense preparations during that period. But certainly, in the last, 6 years, there's been kind of a reawakening and a reframing of resilience at NATO, which is related to the ability of our societies to defend themselves. And the SecGen said it before the summit. He said, you can't have strong militaries without a strong society that underpins them. And I think that this changing security environment, certainly since 2014, has really brought this into light. And we keep learning lessons that we thought we had learned, but clearly some of them have been forgotten. But also this is new ground in a lot of ways. And this is where it kind of connects to the AI discussion, which I think is really interesting. And I'm taking notes as we go on some of the colleagues' views on these aspects. Really, this is about, fundamentally, it's about the things that allow the allies and the alliance itself to defend itself. And those are those critical components, materials, supplies, and other vital elements without which, we couldn't get off the ground or we couldn't get off the start line. I think that there's three kind of things that we have observed, over the last little while. Certainly my team here working on resilience, when this first started, I remember a little vignette. I remember, my colleague who works on joint health, disruptive health crises as a part of our resilience work. And he came and he showed me this WHO report from Wuhan and said, something is weird here. Something isn't right. And I remember running this up the flagpole and getting people to say, hey, this is just some faraway thing. 2 weeks later, we're in lockdown and everybody wants to know, what is this COVID thing and what does it mean? And so, those of us who work in this area have been really, as they say, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And we certainly haven't done that. We've been actively looking at what we could learn from this. And there's three things I think, that I want to talk about. One is the security implications of all of this and the importance of assured access, preparedness and planning for nations and for NATO as we look at some of these vulnerabilities. And here, emerging disruptive technologies like AI are increasing risks and opportunities in this space. And so I think we need to be alive to some of those issues. Secondly, how the military and our armed forces are dependent on the civil and commercial sector. And it was harder before COVID to make this argument because people would say, well, I think everything is okay, but COVID has been a generational disruption. And even our military colleagues are going, this could happen in other areas too. So we need to be alive to that. And I think also this importance of, this, I think some other colleagues have talked about it, kind of a sensitive political conversation, especially for NATO, because we don't, this is not our lane, I guess I could say, but this concern about dependence on foreign supply chains and foreign actors, and also the interdependencies. And this is something I want to pick up, the interdependencies between these sectors and how a cascade effect can be seen. And we saw that in some way in COVID-19, but this concern about interdependencies and cascading effects is something that's certainly on our mind. And as we look to consider, measures to protecting supply chains or building supply chain resilience, it does come back to, doing the peacetime preparedness and planning work that, never goes to waste, as we keep telling people. A dollar spent on preparedness is not a dollar that goes to waste, especially in the security environment that we're in. So I'll leave it at that. I'm interested in the discussion a lot. Thanks again for giving me the floor.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing your time with us. Let me come back to Martin. What we just heard from Hazid is that we are, at least in some technologies, some product, pretty dependent on individual suppliers. And we know this. in how far can technology really help us to, like AI, help us to identify vulnerabilities? Don't we know these vulnerabilities? Is it really an issue of technology, or is it more an issue of mindset and costs?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
No, it's a fair point. And in some ways, it's a combination of both. I mean, look, I think supply chains historically were designed and set up for the most part to minimize cost. And that often meant you constantly pursue the lowest cost sources and you work with the lowest cost inputs into the supply chain. And that created, in many cases, very, very interconnected global supply chains. Now, they are not going to go away. But what's happening now, and as we've heard, is we're no longer only going to solve just for cost. We're going to solve for resilience, customer centricity, and of course, sustainability. And that might lead to the emergence of supply chains that in some cases are regional, in some cases are located very, very close to what I'll call the customer or the point of demand. And to do that effectively, while still doing it in a cost-effective manner, emerging technologies around digitalization will come into play. I want to comment a little bit on artificial intelligence and machine learning, because on the one hand, these things can seem like buzzwords. And what do they really mean? What are they fundamentally? Historically, right, when perhaps we went to school, we learned that one way to model something is to develop kind of like a rough mathematical model or a theory or an equation that roughly predicts what happens in the real world. And you spend a lot of time trying to tweak that model so that it can explain the data. In some ways, machine learning flips that around, where we just look at the data and we're not married to the model. We let the patterns in the data describe and tell us what has happened, what is happening, what will happen, and perhaps even what should happen. So I almost equate it to the way, physicists that came in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they looked at data and said, wait a second, what Newton is saying in his theory isn't necessarily applied. It isn't necessarily correct. So they said, well, gosh, my data must be wrong. And then a few physicists came along and said, you know what? I think my data is right. Perhaps the model is wrong. And then, of course, a whole new branch of physics emerged as a result, and we're all familiar with that. And I think machine learning is a way to start looking at business problems in a very, very different way, and then applying that to the way decisions are made. So to answer your question, do we have this understanding today? Maybe. The answer often lies in the data, but can it be rendered to the point where the decisions are made in a way that people can take action? So whether you're trying to diversify your suppliers, or whether you are trying to better match supply and demand, whether you're trying to understand if something that you're seeing is an outlier effect or something genuinely real, this is where these digital technologies can come into play so that we understand and can model and really frame the supply chain. Ultimately, what we see, what I'll conclude with, is you end up with this digital twin of the real world, right? So you have the real world physical supply chain, you have a digital twin that is showing you what is actually happening. And in some cases, I say twin because you can even control the supply chain in the physical world by manipulating the parameters in this digital twin. So it's like a bidirectional flow of information between this digital rendering and the physical supply chain. So there's just a huge area of opportunity that we see supply chains capitalizing on and doing it in many cases quite successfully.
When I talked to economists in the beginning of this crisis, many told me, oh, gee, our models don't work, and we don't have models for what we are currently facing. And there was a lot of adapting to the crisis and a lot of learning. I said earlier on that I want to make this panel interactive and also bring in the audience, not just for Q&As, but also for a discussion. Now I'm looking, is Joanna still with us? No, otherwise I would have brought her in for talking a little bit about also the ethics side. Do you have any questions in the audience, comments? And don't be shy. I know that it's always a little bit difficult when everybody is online. No. Okay, no problem. Then I bring in a couple of questions which have already been sent to us digitally, and also on the issue of modeling and how to use data, and if those models and the data really work. And for this, I want to hand over again to Marion, because I'm sure that you also had to adapt your models you're working with. What was your experience?
Yes, Tommy, I feared that you would direct that question to me. Indeed, the modeling world has been also under strain, just like supply chains, but already for quite some time, I would say. We are used in trade. We like to work with two types of models, so-called general equilibrium models, without knowing how they function. I think the term general equilibrium already suggests that it doesn't fit for the kind of crisis and disruption mode that we are currently in. So not necessarily the best fit to assess what is going on. Second, we use econometric type of models where we use past data. And also that is not the best way of dealing with situations where we have many and very frequent changes. So yes, we are looking at using different types of data, more real-time data. We are using at different types of models to make sure that we can fill data gaps and to make sure that we can look more into the short-term future and can deal with multiple and frequent changes in our predictions. We have to push economists sometimes out of their comfort zone for this. And I will also admit that we use different types of modelers, different type of expertise increasingly to do our economic modeling. One of the big changes that we observe when it comes to data is that whereas in the past, we were as economists, and I'm speaking about 10 years ago, mainly dealing with data available in the public sphere. The big owners of big data are currently private sector players. And this puts sometimes national governments and also international organizations like ours at a disadvantage. We have, of course, strengthened our collaboration with the private sector also when it comes to data. But my experience is that the private sector is as careful releasing data as governments may have been in the past. I would be very interested to hear Hazid's point of view and experience with this matter. So a lot going on there. Interestingly, and here I will close with this, when we recently organized a workshop, a conference on stress tests in supply chains with speakers from major global supply chains, interestingly, the issue of transparency and access to data came up very prominently, with the private sector asking for more information from governments and governments asking for more information from the private sector. So there's definitely more to be done to increase transparency and to make us all jointly better in reacting to crisis, preempting and being resilient.
Martin, keep that in mind. We come back to you in a second and ask you a little bit about the data and access to the data and transparency and sharing that data with governments, and also maybe sharing that data with governments in third countries. But I do have already more questions I want to pose, and the next one goes to Denise and Dan, and it is a question about the geopolitical conflicts we are now seeing in the trade and investment world. And one of our participants is asking, so what about them? How can we get out of them? And is technology something which could actually help? Or is it something which is going to intensify the conflicts we are currently seeing? Dan, would you like to start? And then Denise.
Yes, sure. I think the newer technologies and the emerging technologies, I think they offer an opportunity for, especially for the United States and the European Union, to come together to a large extent, and agree on certain commonalities with respect to the technologies and regulation of those technologies, and I think also provides a model for bringing more international partners on board with some of the values that we share. So I think I do see the emergence of the new technologies, and especially the increased focus between the United States and the European Union on addressing those technologies. I see that as an opportunity to perhaps reduce some of the geopolitical tensions around the world. I mean, I think we both, understand that our particular values, and I listed some of those off: transparency, rule of law, market-oriented conditions. I think many of those values are those that can serve everybody well globally, and to the extent that we're able to work together on those in the context of new and emerging technologies, I think there's an opportunity for reducing some of the tensions that are out there.
Thank you so much. Over to Denise.
I think I'd add to what Dan just said, maybe the following two things. One is, in order to deal with the tensions and the possible spillover of geopolitics into geoeconomics or international economic relations, well, it's going to be very important to try to shore up the existing frameworks and institutions that enable that conversation to remain rules-based. So for us in Europe, shoring up those institutions, ensuring the return to the primacy of international economic law matters, because again, it does provide at least a zone where everybody stays under one tent and is able to have a civilized conversation. So that is a first order priority from our point of view, because I think governments have a responsibility to avoid unnecessary de-integration of the global economy or fragmentation of the global economy. There's a large planks of the global economy which should remain increasingly integrated globally, because it makes sense to do that. On the other hand, I think there's a challenge on the policy side, which is to try to devise the right instruments and the right international cooperation to deal with a zone where trade and investment meets tech and security issues. And that zone exists. That zone actually may be in the future a zone where there is some necessary partial decoupling or fragmentation. It may be the case. There might be sound security and public order reasons for having controls over trade or investment flows in these specific areas. And there again, here, the like-minded countries at a minimum would be best advised to cooperate to ensure the convergence, at least of their approaches in this area, again, to avoid unnecessary trade and investment tensions in that zone as well. That is one area, a set of areas. Whether you're talking about export controls or you're talking about foreign direct investment screening for security purposes, which again can be the subject of a useful transatlantic conversation, and the structures have been established for that under the Trade and Technology Council, inter alia, building on a history of engagement between the EU, national member states, and the United States, among others, in this space as well.
None of you, and I didn't expect that, none of you said that reshoring and a complete decoupling is the answer to the challenges we are facing. But coming back to you, Sandra, a country which is so dependent on trade can also be very resilient, but also very vulnerable. So what is, or what should, from your point of view, that is a question which just came in, how should Germany reduce its dependencies, diversify, and become more resilient?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, let's say what already Dennis told a couple of minutes before, that the reform of our institutions, as the WTO, for example, is very important to get, let's say, a basis to have a cooperated or cooperation for setting standards. I think to keep our strengths and really to have the ambition to get a leader in this global competition for having common standards, for example. This is the best way to fight these problems. And we share our interests, we share our values, democratic values with Canada, with the United States, and so on. And this really we have to push to get a strong union. And let's say, I think this is the biggest point to fight against China, to my point of view. Other point, what means the resilience of supply chains? I think from a political side, we have 3 open points. I still once again want to get in with the skilled workers. This is a very big point that we have via training, via long life learning, but also immigration, the necessary people in Germany. But also, second point, infrastructure is very important. Digital infrastructure, we already talked about it, but also energy infrastructure is a big point. And third is all the bureaucratic hurdles we have in Germany, but also in the European Union. I think we really have to have a look at this and make it a little bit easier for the companies, because I think the companies, they know very well how to face the concurrence in a global context, but we really have to support them and make it easier for the companies to do their work. I think these 3 points are really important.
Thank you so much. Coming back to the issue of the stress testing and the data, which is necessary for this. One question goes to you, Hazit. One of our participants is interested in getting to know a little bit better how NATO is doing scenario exercises and stress tests to find where we are particularly vulnerable.
Thanks a lot, Stormy, for relaying that question. I think these are things that allies are beginning to get their heads around. How we do this sort of together is still something that takes a bit of effort to get people to look at. We have a usual sort of annual crisis management exercise where we bring in more elements like this to get people thinking about some of these challenges. And you can expect in the years to come there will certainly be more of this added to stress test exactly how a supply chain shock in a crisis could affect the way the alliance, for example, makes decisions, or how it interacts with different nations, including how it interacts with its partners. These are things that are on the agenda. I think a lot of this is also happening within nations who are looking at different elements of wargaming or scenario-based discussions or stress testing, where they are bringing some of these elements in, combining them, and essentially forcing people to think through the problem set. I think part of the problem with COVID, for example, was a failure of imagination. We didn't really understand until we were in the middle of it, what the impact could be. And remember, COVID is actually quite a mild pandemic given the overall scale of potential pandemics that are out there. So I think that part of, take the point very, very well, that stress testing is really important. Part of the problem, of course, is that from a bureaucratic point of view, many of our countries' bureaucratic cultures don't do well with stress testing. People don't want to realize, well, I can't do this well. They don't want to be called out to say, well, you didn't do well on that. So building a culture of exercising is something we talk a lot about at NATO with the allies, that it is important to exercise to failure, to pressure yourself. You can keep those results confidential, absolutely, but use that kind of an example to get your people, your leaders, your decision shapers, your private sector thinking about these issues. And I think that's kind of the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, nobody likes to point out their own vulnerabilities. And I think it also comes down to trust, to trusting each other. In my very opening remarks for this conference, I quoted the G7 who agreed or who vowed last summer that the G7 would work on resilience and build back better. And I can also remember, however, when I was part of the economic resilience panel of the UK G7, when we proposed stress tests and joint exercises, there was a lot of hesitancy. And one of the arguments which I heard was, we could do this, but we also don't have the data for this. We don't have the data from the private sector because this also comes down to competitiveness. And we are not so keen on sharing this. So for our last round, because this is also a question being asked, I want to come back to Martin and to Marion on the issue of, do we have that data? Do companies have that data? Would you be willing to share that data? Under what circumstances? So that actually technologies and systems could really be employed. Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I think data can mean many things, right? So there are many different types of data. So it's difficult to make broad brush statements. We do have to recognize, though, you hear sayings like data is the new oil. What does that really mean? Data is an asset. It is an asset that companies, of course, have to create or build up in a legally compliant way. It has to be done in an ethical way, fulfilling the expectations set with the generation of that data, where the data is coming from. You have to respect all of the necessary privacy laws. Companies have built information, and in some cases they build business models that are unique, that are in part profitable because they leverage that underlying data and information. That may or may not be the same data that's used for these types of stress tests. So one can ask, some companies might feel like it's in their best interest to reveal and share either the source data or the results of that data, assuming that they can do so in a legally compliant and ethical way. I think the important thing is not so much what is the theory behind whether the data can be shared, but what are we really what's the question that's trying to be answered, and really engaging with customer or companies on that level, which could, of course, be a question around what is the resilience, how stress tested is their particular supply chain.
Thank you so much. And also for answering our very general question in a more specific and differentiated way. Over to Marion. What can the OECD do to allow for better, easier data sharing?
I think we can report on one of the best examples of how useful transparency can be. After the great financial crisis, the G20 asked international agencies to build an international information platform on food. And we built something called AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System, that provides information on stocks, harvests, prices, and trade for major crops. And when the pandemic started, the COVID-19 pandemic, and tensions in markets arose, certain countries were considering to block exports of food. Markets were becoming nervous, prices were going up. We could jointly, international agencies together, communicate that there was no need for panic, that there was no need to act against each other, that markets should be kept open. And that's what happened. And during the first years of the pandemic, the food markets did not pose any problem for the economy. So this shows the power of transparency. It gives everybody equal opportunity to make risk assessments and to decide on their action, and it raises trust. What we have done so far more generally when it comes to supply chains is to raise the importance of this issue in our tool for resilient value chains, resilient supply chains. If you Google it, you will find that tool. We have one item called Build Trust. And under that item, we emphasize the collaboration of the public sector with the private sector. In moments of crisis, strong collaboration is important, including around data in order to raise transparency.
Thank you so very much. Since we started a couple minutes late, I'm giving us a couple more minutes for the last round. We said earlier that there are different parts of building resilience. And a very important part is identifying the risks we are talking about. So I don't want to end this panel in a very pessimistic way, but in a realistic way. And what I would like to ask all of you, with a very brief and short answer, what do you think are the greatest risks or the great risk the value chains are facing, which we really have to work on? And maybe we do start in a reversed order. Let us start with Marion.
Thank you, Stormy. We don't like to talk about risks because there is such a self-fulfilling prophecy risk around this. There is definitely, has been in the past years, a lot of policy uncertainty. That's not good for planning in business. So stability and collaboration among governments is something that will help supply chains. We have seen health risks unfolding. I'm not sure to which extent that is entirely under control. There's a lot of discussion about possible climate disruptions. And then there are, in addition, potential risks coming from finance or from digital disruption. So the possibilities of disruptions are plenty. We have gone through a period where we have seen quite a bit of shocks. I mentioned the global financial crisis. There has been a tsunami in the meantime in the Asian region that has disrupted supply chains some 10 years ago. We have gone through a lot of policy changes and now a pandemic. As societies, we have to manage to work together, remain together in order to be resilient in the face of these types of risks. And there, I think I'm with Hasid, that's something we have to learn and to be prepared for in order to cope well with what is coming up in the next years. But overall, I will definitely want to remain optimistic and believe that we will manage.
Yeah, thank you so much for also pointing at self-fulfilling prophecies and how important that is to consider when you do crisis communication. But that's for another panel. Over to you, Denise.
I think I would agree that we have to be mindful of geopolitical risks and various policy-induced distortions, and I can say this from a government perspective. And on the other side, I think on the EU side, we very much trust the private sector to be capable of working on the resilience of supply chains and to be able, and I think it has already happened, to reassess and when necessary, reprice risks. So I wouldn't overemphasize the risks, or rather the inability, frankly, of market forces to actually adapt to these risks, and therefore create a situation which does not necessitate, in terms of the resilience of supply chains, a massive further government intervention in the economy. That's not how we're looking at the issues and the prospects in the near term.
Thank you very much. Martin.
I think many of the risks have already been stated. So I guess what I would say is a risk is that we collectively misjudge the probability of an event moving from being a risk to something that actually happens. And so failure to really assess and capture the likelihood of that risk and whether it needs to be planned accordingly, to me, I could see being a point of vulnerability.
Thank you so much. Hasid?
Yeah, I just wanted to, again, to applaud Marion's philosophical approach to this. I think it's important to think about, what we can do to help mitigate crisis. And really, that's a lot of what, working in resilience is all about. It's about, building your own preparation. And of course, that requires a bit of a pessimistic approach at times. I have a feeling I'm sometimes the Cassandra of my wing here in the headquarters, where I'm always wondering about, well, what could go wrong? But I guess from a NATO perspective, we do look at this from an all hazards perspective, that preparedness is something that you need, in generic terms across these different areas of risk. But I would venture that geopolitical risk, I think, is an issue that we need to look out for. It is something that is back on the radar screen, if I can use the analogy, and something that we do need to look at. I'd say that the pandemic has definitely shown that this new environment that we're in, especially with climate-related risk or evolving pandemics, potentially could also be something that we need to be better prepared and think about. But I would very much applaud and echo what Marian said about the need for stability and collaboration. And that element of collaboration and transparency, could not agree more with that in terms of the importance of assuring the public, assuring our partners, and I think very effectively building trust among like-minded allies and partners that are on the same side of dealing with a potential crisis or vulnerability.
Thank you.
Thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And Dan.
Thanks. I would say horizontally, although it may be challenging to identify particular risks with respect to particular products or issues, but horizontally, I think the big risks come from the underlying challenge of non-market economy policies and practices in the global environment. As Denise said, the market will take care of a lot of these things, but not if there's a big thumb on the scale. So I think that's a big challenge that I think will help address and anticipate potential risks.
Thank you so much. Sandra, unfortunately, already had to go. I'm very sure you all remember Rumsfeld's words on the knowns and the unknowns and the unknown unknowns and the known knowns. You know all of this. So I hope that artificial intelligence will help us to better identify the unknown unknowns. And I hope, to come back to the panel we started with, that we ourselves and our changes in mindset help us to address the risks we already know. So the known unknowns, which we know about, but which we decide not to act upon for whatever reasons. So I think it comes down to technology and us, human decision making. Thank you so much for this really excellent panel. I think we covered a lot of ground. We will now, thank you so much for the panelists, and please give them a big applause. And if you can see our digital audience, they just raised their digital hands and did this. Thank you so very much for being here today.